It all started on a quiet Monday morning, the kind of morning where the sun glints off the dew on the grass and the world feels deceptively calm. For years I had walked past the old wooden bridge at the edge of my property, never imagining that it would one day become the epicenter of a battle that would consume my life. The bridge wasn't technically mine, or so I would eventually find out, but in the mind of the Neighborhood Homeowners Association, it might as well have been. That morning, the HOA's intentions became crystal clear, and the chaos was about to begin. The first clue that something was amiss came with the sound of heavy machinery. The rumble of engines was unmistakable, a low, persistent vibration that shook the soil beneath my feet. At first, I thought it might be road maintenance from the county, but then I noticed the large white trucks with the HOA logo emblazoned on the side. My stomach sank as I realized the truth. They were at my bridge, or at least they thought it was mine. For years, the HOA had been a subtle but constant presence in our neighborhood. They controlled everything from the color of our mailboxes to the height of our hedges and even the angle of our garden gnomes. Most of us tolerated them, perhaps out of habit or fear, and most disputes had been minor, an overgrown lawn here, a crooked fence there. But the bridge, that was different. That bridge wasn't just wood and nails. It was the only passage that connected my property to the rest of the trails that wound through the county parkland. It was a part of my daily life, my routine, and the lens through which I experienced every sunrise and sunset. As I approached the scene, I could see the men working with chainsaws and crowbars, tearing into the structure without a hint of hesitation. The smell of fresh-cut wood mingled with the acrid tang of diesel fuel. They worked methodically, almost gleefully, as if destroying the bridge was some long-awaited act of justice. I could feel my blood boil. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act, fueled by the HOA's overreach and obsession with control. Neighbors had gathered along the edge of their yards, their faces a mixture of curiosity and horror. Some whispered warnings, while others simply watched, fascinated by the unfolding spectacle. It felt like being trapped in a slow-motion disaster film, one where the script had been written by a vindictive entity that held all the cards. I tried to speak up, to assert that the bridge was not under HOA jurisdiction, but my words were drowned out by the roar of saws and machinery. The authority they wielded, at least in their minds, was absolute. Hours passed, and the bridge slowly disintegrated under the relentless assault. Planks were ripped from their moorings, beams were splintered, and what had once been a sturdy crossing became a heap of jagged wood and twisted nails. Every swing of the hammer, every pull of the crowbar felt personal. It wasn't just wood being destroyed, it was the embodiment of years of quiet enjoyment, a space where mornings were greeted with the gentle chirping of birds, and evenings ended with the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. The destruction was complete, leaving only a scar on the landscape that would take decades to heal, if ever. But the strangest part was the smugness of the HOA workers. They moved with an air of righteousness, convinced that they were enforcing rules that had long been forgotten by those they governed. Their belief in their authority was unwavering, a testament to the kind of power that emboldens people to destroy what isn't theirs. It was clear they had not done their homework. Had they consulted the county records or even asked a simple question, they would have discovered the truth. But assumptions, especially those fueled by ego and unchecked power, rarely bend to reality. Later, as I sifted through the debris, I found myself questioning everything. How could something so obviously under county jurisdiction be treated as my private property? Why did the HOA feel entitled to wield such destructive power without verification? And most importantly, what would happen next? This was not just about a bridge, it was about the principles that governed our community, about the thin line between authority and tyranny. I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. By evening, the scene had quieted. The trucks were gone, leaving behind only the twisted remains of what had been a functional and cherished bridge. The neighborhood, once lively with whispers and speculation, had returned to an uneasy silence. In that silence, I realized that the true battle had only just begun. There were phone calls to make, records to examine, and strategies to develop. The HOA might have thought they had won the day, but they hadn't accounted for the storm that was quietly gathering behind the calm exterior of a frustrated and determined property owner. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the wreckage, I took one last look at the ruined bridge. The wood, broken and battered, reflected the fiery hues of the setting sun. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't just about property lines or bureaucratic errors. It was about standing up to the overreach of those who believed they could dictate every aspect of our lives. And standing up meant more than just words. It meant action, it meant persistence, and it meant a willingness to fight even when the odds seemed stacked against me. Tomorrow, I would begin the painstaking process of uncovering the truth. I would dig through county records, contact officials, and prepare for the confrontation that was inevitable. But tonight, as the neighborhood returned to its uneasy routine and the stars blinked silently above, I allowed myself a single moment to imagine the outcome. The bridge might have been destroyed, but the spirit behind it, the connection it represented, the life it supported, remained unbroken. And so, as darkness enveloped the landscape and the broken remnants of the bridge lay scattered like the pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit, a plan began to form in my mind. It was a plan fueled not by vengeance, but justice. The HOA had made a grave mistake, one that would soon become painfully clear. The bridge, it turned out, was county property. The destruction they had wrought was not just overreach, it was an official error that would have consequences far beyond what they had imagined. Little did they know, their assumption that it was mine had set in motion a chain of events that would shake the neighborhood to its core. By the time the truth emerged, the quiet, orderly streets that once seemed so safe would become a battlefield of wills, a testament to the dangers of unchecked authority. And I, the reluctant yet determined property owner, would be at the center of it all, ready to reveal the truth and reclaim not just the bridge, but the principle that no one, not even the HOA, was above accountability. The morning after the bridge was destroyed, the neighborhood seemed unusually quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath in anticipation of the next move. I felt no relief, only a simmering sense of urgency. The destruction of the bridge was no ordinary HOA overreach. It was a blatant act that demanded answers. That morning, armed with determination and a stack of legal pads, I began the painstaking process of uncovering the truth. First, I turned to the county records. The process was tedious, involving trips to the local office, navigating endless shelves of property deeds, and deciphering pages filled with legal jargon. Every step, however, brought a glimmer of hope. After hours of scanning documents, comparing surveys, and tracing old maps, I finally found the confirmation I had been searching for. The bridge was county property. The evidence was irrefutable, a clear paper trail that contradicted every assumption the HOA had made. Holding the deed in my hands, I felt a surge of vindication. The bridge wasn't mine. The HOA had acted on a false presumption, destroying public property under the guise of enforcing neighborhood rules. The weight of this realization was immense, not just because it validated my position, but because it revealed how recklessly the HOA had acted. This wasn't a small misstep, it was a violation that exposed their overreach in the harshest possible terms. Fueled by this discovery, I decided to document everything. Photographs of the wreckage, detailed notes about the timeline of events, and the scanned county documents became my arsenal. Every piece of evidence was a piece of armor, a safeguard against the HOA's inevitable attempt to justify their actions. I knew from experience that these organizations rarely admit fault willingly, and they were likely preparing their own narrative to spin the incident in their favor. With evidence in hand, I began reaching out to county officials. Phone calls, emails, and in-person visits consumed the next several days. Some officials were sympathetic, others skeptical, but the truth could not be hidden. The bridge was clearly under county jurisdiction. The county had maintained records of inspections, repairs, and public access rights, and nowhere did it list the bridge as private property. The confirmation from officials was both comforting and alarming. This was bigger than a neighborhood dispute. The HOA had acted illegally, and their mistake had public consequences. Meanwhile, word of the destruction began to spread through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once watched in silent curiosity now approached cautiously, some with apologies, others with curiosity tinged with concern. Whispers circulated about the audacity of the HOA, the destruction of public property, and the potential fallout. People who had long avoided conflict were now reluctantly taking sides, realizing that the incident had far-reaching implications beyond a single bridge. The HOA, however, was undeterred. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, letters were sent claiming they had acted within their authority, and social media posts painted a picture of a property owner who had claimed ownership of a bridge and allegedly refused repeated notices. Their story was a classic tactic: deflect blame, question the victim's credibility, and create confusion. But with county documents and official confirmation on my side, their story was built on sand. As tensions escalated, I realized that confrontation was inevitable. The HOA board would not quietly accept the revelation that they had destroyed public property. Meetings were scheduled, letters drafted, and calls exchanged in preparation for what promised to be a heated showdown. I spent hours rehearsing the points I needed to make, the evidence I had to present, and the questions I needed answered. There could be no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. Every detail mattered. During this time, I also began to notice a subtle shift in the neighborhood dynamic. People who had been hesitant to engage with the HOA began approaching me privately, offering support, recounting past grievances, and sharing experiences that mirrored my own. It became clear that the destruction of the bridge was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of overreach and authoritarian behavior. The HOA, it seemed, had long cultivated fear and compliance, but this misstep exposed cracks in their carefully maintained facade. As the days passed, my focus shifted to documenting the damage itself. Engineers and surveyors were contacted to assess the structural destruction, and the cost of rebuilding became a tangible figure. The bridge, once a simple crossing, had now become a symbol of the neighborhood's struggle between authority and accountability. Every splintered plank represented not just physical destruction, but a breach of trust, an intrusion into the lives of those who had long respected the rules of the community. Late one evening, as I reviewed my notes and organized the piles of documentation, a deep sense of resolution settled over me. This was no longer just about a bridge. It was about ensuring that no individual or group could wield power unchecked. The HOA's actions had consequences, and I was determined to see them held accountable. The confrontation would not be easy, and I knew resistance would be fierce, but the truth was on my side. Evidence, persistence, and public accountability would be my tools in this battle. The next step, I realized, would be the first official confrontation. Armed with county confirmation, photographs, and a growing wave of neighborhood support, I prepared to attend the next HOA board meeting. This meeting would not be a casual discussion, it would be a reckoning. Every argument, every claim, and every assertion would be scrutinized. The bridge, once a quiet part of daily life, had transformed into the catalyst for a conflict that threatened to redefine the balance of power in our neighborhood. As night fell and the documents were carefully stacked in folders, I allowed myself a moment to imagine the upcoming confrontation. The HOA may have thought they were untouchable, immune to accountability, but the tide was turning. The bridge's destruction was a public error, and the truth was relentless. The neighborhood, once passive and obedient, was beginning to awaken to the reality that authority could not operate without oversight. The day of the HOA board meeting arrived like a storm on the horizon, heavy with anticipation and an undercurrent of fear. What had started as a simple act of destruction, an erroneous assumption that a bridge belonged to me, had snowballed into a confrontation that would expose the true nature of the neighborhood's authority. The boardroom, a nondescript room in the community center, was buzzing with whispers, murmurs, and the faint shuffle of anxious feet. For weeks, the bridge had been the talk of the neighborhood, and now the tension that had simmered in private conversations would spill into the open, raw and unfiltered. I entered the room with my folders of evidence in hand, a meticulously organized arsenal that included photographs of the destroyed bridge, county documents proving ownership, detailed timelines, and assessments from structural engineers. Each piece was a statement. The bridge wasn't mine, and the HOA had acted without jurisdiction. My goal was simple, but monumental: to reveal the truth, hold the board accountable, and force them to acknowledge the consequences of their actions. The boardroom itself reflected the formality the board tried to project: rows of chairs, a long polished table, and the imposing presence of the board members at the head, faces composed yet rigid, eyes flicking with a mix of curiosity and calculated evaluation. Neighbors filled the remaining seats, some visibly uneasy, others brimming with a quiet satisfaction that justice might finally be served. The atmosphere was charged, each breath heavy with anticipation. The meeting began, though the first moments were filled with procedural formalities that masked the storm brewing beneath. The board attempted to frame the discussion as a routine review of property maintenance and neighborhood regulations, a thin veneer designed to maintain control. But beneath the polished language, the tension was palpable. Every eye in the room seemed to measure intent, weighing the gravity of the bridge incident against years of unchallenged authority. When I stood to speak, the room shifted. The folders of evidence felt heavier in my hands than they ever had on paper. I presented the timeline, the photographs, and the county documents, systematically dismantling the board's assumptions. Each piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of their argument, a silent yet undeniable challenge to the narrative they had spun in the weeks following the bridge's destruction. Murmurs spread across the room as neighbors leaned in, collectively absorbing what was being revealed. The reaction of the board was telling. Faces that had previously exuded confidence now betrayed signs of unease. Their attempts to justify the destruction, claims of miscommunication, and prior warnings crumbled under the weight of official county records. The evidence left no room for ambiguity. The bridge had been public property all along. Their authority, once perceived as absolute, had been exposed as flawed and unchecked. Neighbors began to speak quietly amongst themselves, sharing stories of past grievances that mirrored my own. Tales of overreaching mandates, arbitrary fines, and intrusive inspections emerged, painting a picture of a pattern of authoritarian behavior. The bridge, once a solitary act of destruction, had become a symbol of systemic overreach, sparking a collective awareness that threatened to shift the balance of power. The board, sensing the momentum shifting, attempted to regain control through procedural delays and verbal deflection. Yet every tactic they employed only reinforced the truth of their misjudgment. The county documents were irrefutable. The damage was visible and documented. Public opinion, now subtly aligned against them, lent weight to every point I made. What had started as a small act of confrontation had grown into a full-scale accountability challenge, one that no procedural maneuver could easily contain. Hours passed as the discussion intensified. Questions were raised about the decision-making process, the authority under which the bridge had been destroyed, and the liability for the costs incurred. I presented cost assessments from engineers, estimates for repairs, and evidence of the disruption caused to the neighborhood by the destruction of a public asset. Each point tightened the noose of accountability, slowly eroding the board's composure. By the time the meeting approached its formal conclusion, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically.
Where there had been smug confidence, now lingered discomfort and quiet realization. The board could no longer maintain the illusion of control. The bridge's destruction was no longer just a minor neighborhood dispute. It was a public error with clear responsibility, one that had been documented, witnessed, and confirmed by official records. The consequences were now undeniable. Outside the boardroom, the neighborhood waited, having heard of the showdown through whispers and early arrivals. News traveled fast in communities where every event was amplified by shared experiences and collective memory. The bridge, destroyed in a moment of misguided authority, had become the catalyst for neighborhood awakening. Residents who had once remained silent were now observing, waiting to see whether authority could bend under scrutiny or whether accountability would prevail. As the last remarks were made and the formal meeting adjourned, I stepped outside to the cool evening air. The tension that had gripped the room lingered like smoke, thick and pervasive. For days, the neighborhood would dissect every word spoken, every facial expression, every moment of hesitation from the board. The bridge, though still in pieces, had fulfilled its new role, a symbol of truth exposed and authority challenged. In the days following the meeting, correspondence from the HOA began to shift in tone, an acknowledgement of error emerging amidst attempts to soften the narrative. While they were unlikely to fully admit wrongdoing, the pressure was evident. County officials, neighbors, and public scrutiny had combined to force a recognition of their overreach. The unassailable authority of the board had been shaken, and the bridge, destroyed but not forgotten, had catalyzed the change. That night, as I walked past the remnants of the bridge, I considered the journey that had brought me here. What had begun as a quiet morning disrupted by chainsaws had grown into a confrontation that challenged the very structures of neighborhood authority. The board underestimated the importance of accountability, the power of evidence, and the resolve of a property owner unwilling to let error go unchecked.
The aftermath of the boardroom confrontation reverberated through the neighborhood like a shockwave. What had started as a seemingly small dispute over a bridge had become the centerpiece of a storm that exposed cracks in the HOA's authority and rallied the community in ways I could never have predicted. News of the board meeting spread quickly, first by word of mouth, then through texts, emails, and social media posts. By the next morning, nearly every neighbor was aware that the HOA had destroyed a bridge they did not own, and the county had confirmed it. The shift in the neighborhood dynamic was palpable. Where there had once been polite compliance and quiet acceptance of HOA mandates, now there was chatter, speculation, and a subtle resistance growing like weeds along the sidewalks. Some neighbors approached me cautiously, grateful yet wary of retaliation. Others shared stories of previous conflicts with the board, stories that suddenly made sense in the context of the bridge incident. The pattern was undeniable. The HOA had long relied on fear, miscommunication, and assumptions to enforce its version of control. Meanwhile, the HOA itself reacted with calculated aggression. Letters arrived in mailboxes, framed as clarifications or warnings, attempting to frame me as a provocateur who had misrepresented ownership and sought to undermine community standards. Social media posts followed a similar line, painted in overly formal language, yet beneath the veneer there was a clear effort to maintain authority and protect the board's image. They were fighting to rewrite the narrative, but the mountain of evidence I had compiled stood in stark contrast to their attempts. I spent hours preparing for the inevitable escalation. With the county documentation, photographs, and detailed assessments, I developed a comprehensive record not just of the bridge itself, but of the HOA's overreach and repeated mismanagement. Legal counsel became a consideration, though the focus was not initially on litigation, but on accountability, public exposure, and the restoration of the bridge. Each step, carefully documented, became another arrow in the quiver of truth. The community began to mobilize quietly. Meetings in garages, porches, and local cafes centered on the bridge incident and the broader implications of unchecked authority.
Petitions were drafted, residents were encouraged to document similar overreach, and a sense of collective vigilance emerged. The bridge, once a simple wooden crossing, had become the emblem of resistance, a tangible symbol of the consequences when power was exercised without accountability. Tensions between the HOA and residents escalated. The board, frustrated by the lack of control and the growing opposition, began to implement restrictive policies under the guise of neighborhood safety. New fines, sudden inspections, and cryptic letters created unease, further reinforcing the perception that the HOA's authority was reactionary and arbitrary. It became clear that their attempts to assert dominance were not grounded in legality, but in ego and fear of losing control. As the days went by, public attention grew. Local news outlets caught wind of the story, drawn by the unusual mix of neighborhood drama and bureaucratic blunder. Headlines highlighted the destruction of a county-owned bridge, the HOA's overreach, and the community's growing frustration. Suddenly, what had been a private dispute became a story of public interest. Calls and emails from journalists seeking comment added pressure to an already tense situation, forcing the HOA to tread carefully while also testing their ability to manage public perception. I continued to document everything meticulously. Every interaction with the board, every letter sent, every new restriction imposed was recorded. The broken bridge itself was photographed repeatedly, showing the passage of time, the deterioration caused by neglect, and the human impact of the destruction. Each image reinforced the narrative. This was not a minor dispute, but a significant breach of authority with real consequences for the community. But the HOA did not yield. The board attempted to reclaim control through intimidation, sending legal threats and formal letters warning of community consequences if compliance was not immediately restored. Their language was deliberate, trying to instill fear and create doubt among residents. Yet each attempt only strengthened the resolve of those who had witnessed the destruction firsthand. The community had seen the bridge reduced to splinters, and no empty threat could erase that reality. The tension reached its peak when a second neighborhood meeting was scheduled, this time involving county representatives. The goal was clear: to address the legal implications of the bridge's destruction and to hold the HOA accountable for acting beyond its authority. Residents gathered in numbers far larger than the first board meeting, their presence a silent but powerful statement. The room, packed with concerned neighbors, reflected a united front, a stark contrast to the board's isolated confidence. The HOA members for the first time faced scrutiny from multiple angles simultaneously. Residents' questions, county officials' clarifications, and the growing documentation of their overreach. Each denial or excuse they offered was met with evidence that contradicted their claims. The more they attempted to assert authority, the more their credibility eroded. It was a delicate dance of power, and with each passing moment, the balance shifted toward accountability and transparency.
The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for weeks reached its peak as the final confrontation with the HOA unfolded. What began as a simple misunderstanding, an assumption that the bridge belonged to me, had evolved into a full-scale reckoning, a collision of authority, evidence, and public accountability. By the time the last formal meetings were scheduled, it was clear to everyone involved that the outcome would set a precedent for the neighborhood's future. The county's involvement had shifted the balance decisively. Representatives made it unequivocally clear the bridge was public property, and the HOA had no authority to destroy it. The documentation I had painstakingly compiled, photographs, county deeds, structural assessments, was presented once more, this time in a public forum, leaving the board with little room to maneuver. Their previous tactics of deflection, intimidation, and misinformation had been systematically dismantled. The evidence was undeniable, and the community could see it in black and white. The board, once smug and confident, faced the reality of their overreach. For weeks, they had attempted to control the narrative, sending letters, issuing fines, and leveraging fear to maintain dominance. But the combination of public scrutiny, county confirmation, and neighborhood solidarity rendered these tactics ineffective. Every attempt to regain control only highlighted their errors, reinforcing the collective perception that their authority had limits, and those limits had been crossed. Community members were vocal during the hearings, recounting incidents of arbitrary enforcement, overreach, and intimidation. The bridge, now symbolic of the broader struggle against unchecked authority, had united the neighborhood. Where once there had been fear and hesitation, now there was solidarity and determination. Residents demanded accountability, not just for the destruction of the bridge, but for the pattern of behavior the HOA had exhibited over the years. As the hearings concluded, the consequences for the board became clear. Official records noted the violation, fines were imposed for damages to county property, and the board was instructed to submit a formal plan for restitution. Legal counsel emphasized the seriousness of the destruction, making it clear that such actions could not be repeated. The HOA, stripped of its assumed immunity, had been forced to confront the limits of its authority and the necessity of accountability. Attention quickly turned to the restoration of the bridge itself. County engineers, in coordination with local contractors, assessed the damage and developed a plan to rebuild the structure safely and efficiently. The community contributed where possible, volunteering labor, coordinating logistics, and providing materials. What had once been a destructive act became a catalyst for collaboration and neighborhood unity. The bridge would be rebuilt stronger, safer, and with proper oversight, a tangible symbol of resilience and shared effort. During the reconstruction, the neighborhood's atmosphere shifted. Conversations on sidewalks, porches, and local cafes no longer centered on fear of the HOA, but on pride in collective action. The bridge, initially a source of conflict and frustration, became a point of connection. Children, adults, and elderly residents watched as beams were replaced, planks secured, and railings restored, each nail a testament to community strength. The bridge, once broken by assumption and overreach, now embodied accountability, collaboration, and renewal. In the weeks that followed, the HOA's influence waned. Board members were replaced, policies were revised, and new protocols were established to ensure transparency and prevent unilateral decisions in the future. The incident had catalyzed a cultural shift within the neighborhood, redefining the relationship between authority and residents. Trust, once fragile, began to rebuild alongside the bridge itself. The final piece of closure came when the newly reconstructed bridge was opened to the public. Walking across it, I reflected on the journey that had brought the neighborhood from quiet compliance to active engagement. The bridge, now restored, was more than a crossing. It was a symbol of accountability, resilience, and the power of standing up for what is right. Residents greeted one another warmly. Neighbors who had once hesitated to speak were now collaborating openly, and a sense of shared purpose filled the air. As the sun set over the newly rebuilt structure, casting golden light on the polished wood, it was clear that the neighborhood had changed irrevocably. The HOA, once an unchallenged force, had been reminded that authority comes with responsibility, and that unchecked power can be challenged, exposed, and corrected. The bridge, both physically and symbolically, had endured trials and emerged stronger. In the end, the story of the bridge served as a reminder that assumptions, overreach, and misjudgments carry consequences. The destruction that had sparked conflict had ultimately led to accountability, collaboration, and restoration. The neighborhood had learned that vigilance, persistence, and truth are stronger than intimidation and unchecked authority. As twilight settled, I paused at the center of the bridge, looking at the community thriving around it. The journey had been exhausting, tense, and at times frustrating beyond measure. Yet, through the process, something remarkable had emerged, a neighborhood that understood the value of both vigilance and collaboration,
a restored bridge, and a clear message that authority must always be exercised with care, transparency, and respect for those it governs. The bridge had been destroyed, challenged, and rebuilt, just as the neighborhood had been tested, confronted, and strengthened. In that moment, it was evident. Some battles are fought not just to reclaim property, but to restore integrity, balance, and the trust that binds a community together. And this bridge, now whole and resilient, would forever stand as a testament to that hard-earned victory.